Welcome to the reading of tributes of the American Academy of Arts and Letters. I am Billy Chen, President of the Academy. Since 1903, the Academy has presented tributes to members who have passed away. These are typically read at our headquarters building in New York City before our spring and fall dinners. For the past year and a half, however, we have been presenting tributes as live readings on Zoom, and the virtual format has allowed us to reach a new and wider audience. So we welcome you all. Tonight we'll be reading tributes to 5 Academy members: the playwright Terrence McNally, the writer Ward Just, the artists William Bailey and Wolf Kahn, and the composer Mario Davidovsky. These are being recorded and will be posted to our website in a few days. To begin, playwright and Tony Award winner Matthew Lopez will read the tribute to Terrence McNally.
How do you describe a chameleon? How does one take the measure of a shapeshifter? If asked to describe the typical Terrence McNally play, where would you begin? They're funny, obviously, sometimes raucously, sometimes mordantly. They are domestic, except for when they're operatic. They're gay, except for when they're heterosexual. They're about men, except when they're about women. In truth, the only way to describe a typical Terrence McNally play is to first acknowledge there is no such thing. And in doing so, you arrive at the heart of what made Terrence one of the great American dramatists. With every play that he wrote, he reinvented himself, revealing new facets about his imagination, his intellect, and his heart. Terrence's plays are perfect reflections of their author. They are willfully iconoclastic, disarmingly witty, sharply insightful, and most of all, profoundly humane. His characters, while wildly divergent from play to play, are all drawn from the same keen observe and eye. They are imperfect. They struggle for meaning in their lives. They want to be loved. They louse up their chances to love others. They are, in short, people we know. They are, in fact, us. To the casual theater goer who doesn't bother to study the playbills, there is no link between Frankie and Johnny and the Claire de Lune and Masterclass. There's no kinship to be found between lips together, teeth apart, and a perfect Ganesh. And yet, to those of us who are raised on Terrence's work and those who work in the theater and have spent years collaborating with him, we know that the connective tissue was Terrence himself. Terrence disliked being labeled a gay playwright, even though he was a playwright who was gay. And he wrote some of the most essential works about gay life. One hardly has to look any further than his seminal 3-act play, Love, Valor, Compassion, to find evidence that Terrence spent much of his life thinking about what it means to be a gay man, particularly in the age of AIDS. But it is actually lips together, teeth apart that I think shows us what Terrence meant when he refused the title of gay playwright. Of all the American plays that have dealt with the epidemic, none have ever approached it from the heterosexual perspective until that play. It's set at the Fire Island home of a recently deceased gay man, and it tells the tale of 2 straight couples grappling with the same wounds, the same trauma of loss that gay couples had spent years experiencing. With that play, Terrence pulled off an extraordinary feat of literary compassion. He took a tragedy for the gay community and revealed that it was in fact a tragedy for all humankind. Only a chameleon would be able to think, let alone write in those terms. It's what defined Terrence as an artist. I was introduced to Terrence's work by watching the Tony Awards every year as a theater-obsessed teenager. Terrence is one of only 2 playwrights who have won the Tony for Best Play in 2 consecutive years. Love, Valor, Compassion, followed by Masterclass, and then the hat trick of adding Best Book of a Musical for Ragtime 2 years later. I began reading and then devouring his plays in college. Love, Valor, Compassion, and Lips Together, Teeth Apart were deeply influential on me, as was his short play, Andre's Mother. Of all the writers I encountered at that time, Terrence was the only one who kept asking me as a reader and an audience member to adapt along with him. If other writers invite you to join the flow of their certain constant waterways, Terrence picks you up by the shoulders and delivers you to altogether different lands. Following the trajectory of Terrence's imagination is not a passive endeavor for his audiences. Shortly after I arrived in New York in my early 20s, I finagled my way into Hal Prince's office to ask him for advice on how to embark on a writing career. He gave me Terrence's phone number and told me to call him and offer my services as an assistant on whatever project he might be working on. I called him and left a voicemail that Terrence miraculously returned, and we agreed that I would assist him on a workshop of his new musical with Lynn Ahrens and Stephen Flaherty, A Man of No Importance. Now, I had no real responsibilities as his assistant because he had no need of one. Instead, he allowed me to observe him work. He would explain changes to me, asking if I understood why they were being made. I realized I wasn't his assistant, I was his student. Terrence allowed me the gift of simply being in the room and watching the process unfold. Looking back at that experience, having since worked on workshops of my own plays, it amazes me that he would willingly take time to teach a stranger about his creative process. At the time, I found it rather generous of him. Now, from the hindsight perspective, having stood in his shoes, I understand that it was monumentally generous of him. We agreed that at the end of the workshop, Terrence would read some of my work. I sent him the play that would eventually become The Whipping Man. I told him I wasn't all certain I was going to be a writer, that I was a writer, and part of me thinks that I was hoping he would make the decision for me. A few days later, he left a voicemail on my phone, which he praised and critiqued and challenged the play he had read. And then at the end of it, he said, "You told me you were questioning whether or not you were a writer or whether or not you should pursue this as a career. Well, let me be the first to tell you that yes, you are a writer and you should continue writing." And because of Terrence, I did continue writing. And then when I saw him years later at the opening of The Whipping Man in New York, I saw him and he said to me, "I'm glad you took my advice." Now, there are many who assume that with The Inheritance, I was chasing after Angels in America. That's actually not true. I was chasing after Terrence. He was the spiritual godfather of the play. Growing up in the 80s and the 90s in a very conservative panhandle of Florida, there weren't a lot of comforting voices for young queer kids, but Terrence was one of them for me. Through his work and through his friendship, Terrence taught me that it's possible to be gay and live a life filled with love and dignity. That was the legacy I was chasing after as I wrote The Inheritance. None of the critics, nobody who wrote about the play, either in praise of it or in critique of it, ever got that about it. But Terrence did, and that made me incredibly proud. In the year and a half since his passing, I've thought a lot about Terrence's legacy, and particularly in light of the fact that within a 12-week period in 2020, we also saw the deaths of Larry Kramer and Mark Crowley. Their passing in such quick succession felt like a cruel trick of timing, but it can also be viewed from a hopeful perspective. 30 years ago, it would have been impossible to imagine reading obituaries for gay men dying in their 80s. Terrence spent his life refusing definition. From the town he grew up in, to the people he loved, to the artistic community with which he maintained a nearly constant yet affectionate lover's quarrel throughout his career, Terrence was an insider and an outsider, a pack animal and a lone wolf. His plays, his musicals, and his libretti all reflected that tension. I want to leave you with an image. I want you to imagine for a moment that all the characters a playwright invents are at a cocktail party in honor of their creator. Just think how delightful Wendy Wasserstein's party would be. And of course, Noel Coward. Swing by the Tennessee Williams party, but don't stay too long. Avoid altogether the Eugene O'Neill event if you know what's good for you. And then I want you to imagine the Terrence McNally cocktail party, at which the guest of honor is sipping a seltzer thanks to the sure-footed 12-stepping of Angela Lansbury. Now imagine all the characters that you will encounter at that party and how surprisingly varied the room is. There's Buzz Hauer singing I Could Have Danced All Night with Maria Callas's rehearsal pianist. There's Mendy chasing Callas around the room while the diva explains to Sally Truman just what exactly is wrong with her look. You could go on and on and on. The Terrence McNally cocktail party would be filled with people who have no idea why they were invited to the same party. Indeed, they would be people who would never be invited to the same party. And yet, they are all in a room because of Terrence's shape-shifting imagination. They all drink, sometimes too much. They sing opera, of course, as well as show tunes. They laugh, they fight. One may get murdered by the other, but most of all, they love. They gather together to find a way through their pain, their fears, their loss, in order to love, in order to heal. These are all the reasons why we go to see a play by Terrence McNally.
Thank you, Matthew. Next, writer and Academy member Diane Johnson will now read the tribute to Word Just.
It may seem strange to begin a literary tribute to Ward Just by mentioning his considerable personal charm instead of his writing, awards, talents, and industry, qualities I will return to. But his charm is such a salient ingredient of his novels, it seems appropriate to start there. Ward, beloved of everybody with his growly voice, his humor and energy, thereby gained a wide acquaintance and an impressive entree to all varieties and levels of societal, military, and political worlds. He also had a lot of personal courage. He had even covered war in scary parts of the world. All these experiences become the ingredients of his novels, his stories, his journalistic accounts, and explain a luminous quality of his personal character, forthright, accepting, loving, that shines through his friendship, descriptions through his fictional characters, and even his phrases. In preparing this paragraph, I had the pleasure of rereading Ward's novels. On the back of one of them, his 2004 novel, An Unfinished Season, among the collected blurbs, one quote struck me as mistaken. Quote, Ward has earned a place on the shelf just below Edith Wharton and Henry James. James and Wharton are his proper peers, it is true, but I would have said right up there with Henry James and Wharton, or in the great tradition of, referring to his interest in American society and how it works, the nuances of social class and social climbing, the motives and machinations of the political class, and the mores of the solid and solvent social group Ward himself issued from, and which interested him, as it does all novelists of manners. How regrettable that we've lost our cherished colleague and are not to have any more of his works. To address the basic biographical details, Ward Just was born in 1935 in Michigan City, Indiana, and grew up in Waukegan, Illinois, a suburb of Chicago. He attended Cranbrook School and Trinity College in Hartford, Connecticut. He seemed destined to journalism. His father and grandfather published the local newspaper, the Waukegan News Sun, where he worked as a reporter from the age of 20. Eventually, he also wrote for Newsweek and the Washington Post, for whom he covered the Vietnam War, but he defaulted to novel writing as soon as he could afford to, fiction his true vocation. He wrote 14 novels. His, what he considered modest sales were a sore point with Ward, but such is the fate of novelists of manners, the exclusive category to which he belonged. So great was he at understanding the human heart, but also what a person was wearing. He had the worldliest grasp of what politicians or rich people or French people were drinking or buying or vacationing at. This is partly an Illinois gift, I think, born of the Midwesterners' feeling of cultural isolation, but he had the gift to a unique degree. His temperament and his journalistic life led him to live in a number of places. His native territory of the Chicago suburbs, Washington, D.C., France. It was in Paris that I first met him and his wife, Sarah Catchpole. The path from Illinois to Europe has drawn countless Midwestern writers who escaped the tough Mongolian steppe climate, not to mention the cultural conditions, as soon as they can. And this was Ward's path, abetted, as he said, by the ghost of Hemingway, another son of Illinois, who grew up not too far from Waukegan and whose early life in the Chicago, Illinois suburbs followed a similar trajectory through journalism to foreign adventure and eventually to living somewhere else. Ward's initial escape came via the Vietnam War, which he covered for the Washington Post. It marked him deeply, as it seems to have all those anywhere near it. And in his case, physically as well as intellectually and emotionally, when he was injured by a burst of shrapnel. In 1968, he took a leave of absence from the Post to write his first book, To What End? Heavily critical of the senior American military and very early in the buildup of American opposition to the war. He wrote that very few civilians who were in Vietnam for more than a year could argue convincingly in support of the American presence, observing that the Americans were seen by many South Vietnamese not as liberators, but as taking the place of the French. From the 18 months he spent in Vietnam, he would acquire not only experience he would use in his novels, but again, according to his own estimation, he now knew what he didn't know, especially the way people in extreme situations dealt with one another, or as he put it elsewhere when asked about the principal concerns of his work, the inexplicable failure of nerve. One of his publishers described his work as dealing with maturity and maturation. I would add memory. Where to start reading among Ward's 14 brilliant novels? I would say Echo House, about Washington, D.C. power players behind the scenes, or his last novel, fittingly called An Unfinished Season. He himself is said to have said an American romantic, which is not a bad description of the man himself. Any of the 14 will remind us of how much American letters has lost in losing him.
Thank you, Diane. Artist and Academy member Philip Pearlstein will read the tribute to William Bailey.
Bill Bailey was always a gentleman. He was soft-spoken and thoughtful before speaking. Therefore, he was unlike most of our contemporaries of exhibiting artists on the New York art scene of the 1950s and 60s, most of whom made sure their presence and opinions were known. He was a novelty. And his characteristic paintings are his still life arrangements of Italian handmade and hand decorated pottery, neatly lined up on a shelf just at eye level. And shown in rather dimly lit spaces without a play of light and shadow, almost always in a kind of haze. He also paints young women, clothed or nude, in the same manner as the pottery. They sit or stand or lounge around in an interior space, quietly gazing straight ahead, never interacting. And they do the same if they're placed in a landscape setting. None of his paintings are painted from direct visual experience, but they're all from his imagination. And I have read that he refers to his work as metaphysical. rejecting reference to realism. Whether they are small sized or large, they are always meticulously finished. And characteristically, there is not a conspicuous individual brush mark in any of his work, which he simply did not indulge in the kind of self-expression of calligraphic brushstrokes, which were the hallmark of the abstract expressionist painters who dominated the New York scene of the 1950s when he was a student, and later as an instructor at Yale University. I assume that he visited galleries in New York City during those years. Over the past weeks, as I thought about paying tribute to Bill, I realized we shared many things in common, sort of a parallel existence, although he was about 8 years younger than I was. We had both served in the military. I was drafted. It's a big difference, though. I was drafted in 1943 at the height of World War II after training for 1 year, and after training for 1 year as a infantry rifle carrying foot soldier, was sent to Italy and spent the first of my 2 years there in an infantry casualty, or in several infantry casualty replacement units, referred to as rebel-depots. When the fighting in Europe was declared over, I was transferred to an engineering corps, and as a painter of signs for the bombed up roads in Italy. Bailey, on the other hand, enlisted into the armed services in 1951 during the Korean War and served in Japan and Korea through 1953 as a sergeant. But unlike me, he never talked about his time in the Army. We also shared a commitment to continuing education as artists after our wartime experience. And thanks to the GI Bill, which had been passed by Congress at the end of World War II, he and I earned our degrees, as did many others who later became members of the Academy of Arts and Letters. Then after the war, I returned to Carnegie Tech. It then was called Carnegie Institute of Technology in Pittsburgh, to complete the undergraduate program of art and design, which I had the freshman year before being drafted. And then I later went on to earn a master's degree in art history at New York University. Bill Bailey, after his military service, enrolled at Yale University School of Art, where he earned both his undergraduate degree and graduate degrees. And he later became a professor in that program. There, I think it was the teachings of the artist Joseph Albers, who had been part of the Bauhaus movement in Germany before the war, and was now dean of the Yale Art Department when Bailey enrolled, and was highly influential on Bailey's growth as an artist and also on other artists at the time. Albert's own paintings were square shaped and smoothly brushed fields of color, totally unexpressive. Albert's teachings simply had a profound resonance for a number of artists during the decades of the 1950s and 60s. Albert's encouraged Bill as an undergraduate student to apply for a Fulbright fellowship in Italy, in Rome, which he did during his undergraduate years. And that's when Bill fell in love with Italy, as I had myself during my wartime experience there. When, in addition to being always ready for battle, I have been able to visit the art in churches and museums and ancient ruins, which reopened as the German army retreated northwards. And then after the fighting ended, when I remained part of the occupying army, I had the opportunity to travel to many other parts of Italy. Then in 1958, I returned to Rome with my wife and our baby son on a Fulbright fellowship to study art at the student level, even though by then I was already an exhibiting artist and had published several articles in art journals. In Rome, we became part of a rather numerous group of artists from America. We frequently met at events held by either the American Academy in Rome or by these other American artists at their homes, their own homes in Rome or scattered around Tuscany and Umbria. The Bailey family was part of that group. And I recall that at least once we went as part of a group to their charming old house in Umbria and spent a very nice afternoon and evening there. Bill and his wife continued to spend many summers at that house for decades. My teaching career started in the fall of 1959, by which time Bill was already teaching at Yale. He moved briefly to Indiana University for several years. Then he returned to Yale again, where he remained full professor and served as dean of the art school for a few years. He remained there until retirement. My first teaching appointment was at Pratt School of Art, and then at Brooklyn College of the City University of New York, where I remained a full professor until retirement. Our careers as exhibiting artists frequently overlapped, as our paintings were included in group exhibitions of representational artists. Bailey always dismissed the term realist. He referred to his own work as metaphysical. But we exhibited together a number of times in shows across the United States and in several countries, including Russia, abroad. Eventually, we both became members, long-term members of the Betty Cunningham Gallery, where we often met at openings of other artists' works. And then we always had nice meetings together. We greeted each other, and but we probably remained friendly because we never really had a conversation about our individual aims as artists, which usually led, in my experience, to arguments. He will be missed very much as a friend and an artist. Thank you.
Thank you, Philip. On a personal note, I'd like to say that Bill Bailey was my teacher at Yale, and he was both gentle and tough. And I remember he said, "It's not the line that's important, it's the space between the lines." So next, writer and Academy member Joyce Carol Oates will read the tribute to Wolf Kahn.
Quote, "The eye is the arbitrator of all values," Wolf Kahn. Quote, "A colorist has ways of being reborn." Wolf Kahn, a seer of surpassing beauty and luminosity, one of our most distinctive American artists of the 20th century, was born on October 4th, 1927 in Stuttgart, Germany, and died on March 15, 2020, in his longtime residence in New York City. One of the most original, distinctive, and cherished of American 20th century landscape painters, Kahn came to the United States by way of England in 1940 as a child refugee from Nazi Germany. In New York City, the young Kahn began immediately to concentrate on drawing, graduating in 1945 from the High School of Music and Art, and at the age of 19, enrolling in the Hans Hofmann School of Fine Arts, where he seems to have found a community of artists at a young age, whose aesthetic ideals would remain with him through his lifetime. From the highly influential Hans Hofmann, a legendary instructor of young artists, Wolf Kahn was encouraged to explore formal properties in his art, following Hofmann's dictum, quote, "Form exists through space and space through form." Something of a theorist of art as well as an entranced practitioner, Wolf Kahn found a highly personal way to move beyond abstract expressionism in the 1950s, the reigning art ideology, to a newer style exploring figure and representation, predominantly landscape. In his astonishingly lyric, subtle, shape-shifting landscapes of shimmering trees, rivers and lakes, skies and clouds, barns that seem to float as phenomena of sheer color and light rather than material structures of mundane New England practicality, Wolf Kahn seems to us an American visionary in the spirit of Charles Birchfield, whose startlingly bold, pulsating watercolors appear always on the verge of dissolution, and his older contemporary Mark Rothko, of whom Wolf Kahn remarked, quote, "It seemed to me that Rothko took the idea of radiance further than any previous artist. He found that if you took a hard edge between two colors, you inhibit the radiance of one color against the other. Since discovering Rothko, I look at nature in a different way." In Kahn's most extreme stylized paintings and pastel drawings, landscaping figures have lost their distinctive outlines and have become sheer color, relating to the eye and not the conscious analytical mind as the arbitrator of all values. Indeed, not the figure, but the impression of the figures on the mind's eye is the subject that fascinates the artist. For the artist, nature and landscape is material, the starting point of art, not its goal. As for the writer of fiction, the felt reality, to use Henry James's phrase, of characters Setting, social, scene, and plot is the material, the content to be shaped and interpreted, and of interest only then when it has been shaped and interpreted and given a singular form. As Kahn said, quote, "I believe that art exists to celebrate, exalt, excite, and satisfy the demands of the visual. The eye is the arbitrator of all values. This means that the demands of the conceptual mind of politics, of virtue, of God, of social programs, even of self-expression are secondary. The eye reigns." Writers of fiction are in awe of visionary artists who have dispensed with the, quote, scrimmage of life, as D.H. Lawrence called it, the inevitable impedimenta of the novel, inescapable and inevitable. By contrast, Kahn dissolves his material or soars above it or penetrates it with the seeming artlessness of the master. His ostensible subject being the material scenic world imagined as colors suffused with light, with a predilection for rural Vermont, in a timeless suspension of history, Kahn is able to free himself to explore the fascination of color, light, and essential forms. The meaning of the work is simply itself. It is not a message. It is not an activist tract. It is not a personal confessional statement. It is elusive and interior, a spiritual inner radiance. Wolf Kahn once said, when my husband Ray Smith and I visited his studio in Manhattan sometime in the 1980s, that to him, the challenge and interest of the large canvas on which he was working at the time was purely formal. He wasn't painting trees or grass or sky. He wasn't painting Vermont. Alone with his brushes and a sequence of brush strokes, he was solving problems of structure. What about beauty and color? Kahn asks. We envy the visual artist, the joy he can bring to others in a single revelation. And we particularly envy Wolf Kahn the pleasure he took in this painstaking craft as well as his art. Quote, "A colorist has ways of being reborn," as Kahn said in a lecture in February 1989. We mourn the passing of a great artist, even as we feel immense gratitude for the remarkable work he left behind, in which, with each viewing of one of his works, the visionary colorist is again reborn.
Thank you, Joyce. To close the night, composer Eric Chasalow will read the tribute to Mario Davidovsky. And at the end of the tribute, you will hear pianist Stephen Beck play Mario Davidovsky's Synchronisms No. 6 for piano and electronic sounds, which received the 1971 Pulitzer Prize in Music. The piece is approximately 7 minutes long.
I'm honored to speak to you about our friend, Mario Davidovsky. When I first discovered Mario's music, I was deeply affected by what I heard and sought him out as a teacher. And then, in working with him, like so many others, at City College, at Columbia, Harvard, and the summers at the Composers Conference, I discovered just how rewarding a life in music could be. With Mario, there were no shortcuts. Conversations, even by phone, always took hours, and we were happy that they did. Musical discussions inevitably led to speculations about the world, the mind, ethics, humanity, our existence. We learned from Mario how to embrace fundamental contradictions, how these define the world, how they shape our work in it. And we learned too that everything is ultimately connected, usually in ways we might never have imagined. Mario believed that creating music is itself an ethical act. The composer's role in repairing the world, tikkun olam. He believed that the struggle of bringing music into existence and sharing it with others improves the world, at least a little, and enough to matter. He encouraged us to believe in this power and to share in musical metaphoric speculation. As Mario saw it, the desire and challenge to create something coherent out of the whole universe of possibilities is rooted in monotheism. Many elements must be embedded to create the whole, but then that whole becomes indivisible. I remember Mario saying, "You're a real living concrete person and you're a soul." You try to harmonize these things. The music that Mario left for us has a rare elegance. It's clear and concise, yet simultaneously richly layered and highly contrapuntal, at times juggling multiple narratives, dense with meaning. Many listeners find it compelling, yet unlike anything else that they know. How can music be at once so sensuous and beautiful, and yet so complex? Technically speaking, Davidovsky was able to achieve these qualities by creating a new counterpoint of musical time and acoustical space. There have been many composers interested in elevating the role of timbre in music, but to my mind, Davidovsky was the first to find a way to completely integrate timbre into musical thinking so that it motivates and works in counterpoint with harmony and rhythmic impetus. The subtle details in music both invite and require the listener to remain completely engaged, one might say to become completely alive. Among the many things that defined Mario as a musician was his role as one of the true pioneers of electronic music. His early years of intensive experience in the Columbia Princeton Electronic Music Center focused his ear on the details of sound in ways that would inform all of his music thereafter. When my wife, Barbara, and I recorded an interview with him in 1996, he compared being in that early studio to finding oneself in the desert with a knife and a jug of water and being forced to find your way out. That image is classic Mario, down to earth and direct, but also poetic. Mario had a generous spirit and boundless energy, and that is deeply missed. I feel very fortunate to have been his student and his friend.
Thank you, Eric. And thank you, Stephen Beck. And thank you to everyone for joining us tonight for a reading of tributes. We hope you will join us for future tribute programs, which will continue through this winter. Until then, be well. Good night.